said this was a large cottage, Veronica Niles said to the realtor as she looked at the house in front of her, peering over her Armani sunglasses. Marty laughed the way a person does to humor a person, not that what the person said was genuinely funny. And the color is horrible, Veronica continued. Mari, a realtor in Millstown area for 5 years, was very used to dealing with people like the Niles. Rich and pretentious, they always expected vacation homes they were looking at to be something out of lifestyles of the rich and famous versus the cute cottages that were the majority of what occupied the quaint seaside town of Thistle Harbor, the now in spot to have a vacation home. Why don't we take a look inside, Mari said to the couple and began to walk up the stairs leading to the wraparound porch. This was one of the most attractive cottages still left on the market. Mari opened the door and stepped aside to let the Niles walk in front of her. Veronica Niles was in her late 40s, although the cosmetic surgery team that worked on her kept most of her looking perfectly plastic. She was about 5'4", wore stiletto heels that Mari was sure cost more than a week's worth of her own salary. Veronica kept her blonde hair, not natural, in a tight ponytail and held her designer purse with perfectly manicured hands. She was a walking designer label stereotype. Mr. Niles, or Robert as he insisted, was in his late 50s and bald. He was tan and came from a booth. Just shy of 5'7", he was towered over by his wife, which was evident in more than just height. Mari showed the couple around the house. She told them every detail of the construction, including the newest additions of the skylight and pool, which many of the homes in the area didn't possess. As they entered the sunroom that looked over the bay, Victoria's shrill voice cut the air. "What in the hell is that thing?" she said, cringing and pointing at something crumpled in the corner of the room. Mari glanced over the corner at what looked like a pile of rags. Mari closed her eyes and took a steadying breath. This was the part that she always hated when she showed the house. Sometimes she was lucky and the prospective buyers wouldn't even see it. Then, when she did, her required disclosure, it sounded like a silly story. Mari turned to the couple, clasping her hands in front of her. She began to speak without making eye contact. "That is Rosie. It is a doll left from the original owner of the house." She paused for only a beat before resuming. "Over 100 years ago, this house was built by Mr. Stephen Standen. Mr. Standen built many of the seaside cottages, mainly to lure better skilled labor to his fishery. One of the families that came were the Miltons. The Miltons had a daughter named Rose. Mr. Standen took, let's just say, an unhealthy interest in Rose, given her age of 8. Things such as this were hardly spoken of back then, but Mr. Milton confronted Mr. Standen in public after his daughter told him that Mr. Standen played the tickle game with her. 2 days later, there was an accident and Mr. Milton died at the fishery. Mrs. Milton, distraught and ashamed, took her life. Rose was found over a week after her mother had hung herself, alone in the house with her mother's body. Rose was made a ward of the state, and little else was known about what happened to her. When the house was restored years later, the doll was found inside. Every person who's owned the house that has tried to dispose of the doll has had a tragic accident or worse." When Mari finished, she looked into the very annoyed face of Miss Veronica Niles. "Are you trying to say that this house is haunted by a doll?" When the last word left her mouth, she began to make a noise Mari could only put in the category of a cackle. The irony of her sounding like a wicked witch from a fairy tale was not lost on Mari. "I was merely given the required disclaimer," Mari straightened her stance. "The current owners wanted to ensure that outside of the disclaimer of the crime, that it was required by the state, that potential buyers were warned about the doll and the ramifications of its attempted removal," Mari finished. Veronica made a noise and waved her hand in front of Mari as if she was waving her off like a small bug. Mari smiled a well-placed, practiced fake smile and walked in towards the kitchen. Glancing back to where the doll lay and said, "Please let me know if you have any further questions. I'll be in the kitchen." Again, Veronica waved her away, and Mr. Niles continued to look out at the pool area and the view beyond. After about 15 minutes, Mr. Niles came into the kitchen and told Mari they would be in touch. Before Mari left, she made one last circuit through the house. Although she didn't like being alone in the house, it was her responsibility to make sure the premises were secure. When she got to the back porch, she heard the crack of thunder and saw storm clouds off in the distance. She looked over at the doll in the corner. If it stayed outside, it would be ruined. The moment she thought that, she wished she hadn't. She turned to walk away, feeling if she didn't get involved at all, it would be better. She took a tentative step and then realized she needed to make the safe choice and not the easy one. Mari turned and walked over to the doll and gently picked it up. It was a rag doll with yarn for hair and buttons for eyes, one which was missing. It was very old, and it was obvious that it had been sewn by hand. Mari realized that Rose's mother had most likely sewn it and given it to her daughter. Another crack of lightning brought Mari back to the present, and she quickly hurried inside. She took the doll to the sitting room that had a window seat. It was one of the other great spots in the house that looked out onto the bay. She placed it all in the seat and headed for the door. As she closed and locked the door, Mari thought she heard the sound of footsteps on the wood floor and a faint sound of laughter. It only took a couple of days for Mari to receive an offer letter from the Niles attorney for the property. They offered the exact asking price, and a couple of weeks later the house was sold. 6 months later, a courier delivered a package to Mari, and in it was a letter and a business card and a check. Dear Mrs. Skriller, enclosed please find a check that will more than adequately compensate you for the listing of the sale of the house at 14 Mill Street. My attorney's firm is at your disposal to assist you with anything you might find necessary to have this transaction occur with the utmost speed. The only thing I require, other than your discretion, is the reason and nature of my wife's death, is that you disclose the nature of the house and only allow the purchase to a buyer who understands the property's particular nuances and thus will treat it with the correct precaution. If this deal is amicable, please reach out to my attorney, and I have closed a card for your convenience. Regards, Robert Niles. Mari looked at the card, which had the name of a firm that had previously assisted the Niles in the closing. She then looked at the check, which was made out for $50,000, which was more than 3 times what she'd make on the sale of the house. She placed the check on the table and picked up the phone to call the attorney. She needed to work out the details and get the keys. The house was on the market for less than 2 days, and Mari got the first buyers wanting to look at the property. Mari pulled up to the curb to find the couple and the realtor already waiting. As Mari approached, she painted the all-too-familiar smile on her face. Hello, I'm sorry I'm a couple minutes late. As she shook their hands, she tried to surmise if this would be worth the time. Their name was Mauston, and they were both successful in the medical field. Mari gave her normal spiel about the location and the different features of the house as she walked up the steps and into the house. When they walked through the sitting room, the realtor asked, "What is that?" And Rosie was right where Mari had left her.